Before the turn of the 20th century, it was a district within the vast Ottoman Empire. It was not an empty land, a desert waiting to be made to bloom. On the contrary, it was a populated, functioning society, overwhelmingly Arab, a majority Muslim population, significant Christian communities, Jewish communities who had lived there for centuries. These communities were deeply integrated into the social and economic fabric. Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, Nablus. The countryside was dotted with hundreds of villages. Farmers cultivated olives, farmers cultivated grains, farmers cultivated fruits. Their lives were intertwined with the seasons and the land they'd worked for generations. This society was part of a larger Arab world undergoing the Nahda, the cultural awakening. Palestinians were developing a distinct national identity. Newspapers were published. A sense of shared destiny was beginning to emerge among Arab inhabitants. The idea of Palestine as a separate self-governing entity was taking root. The Zionist movement emerged in late 19th century Europe as a political response to the persistent and often violent anti-Semitism faced by Jewish communities. It was a nationalist ideology, not a religious one. Its founders, like Theodor Herzl, concluded the only solution was a Jewish state. While other locations were considered, the movement ultimately focused on Palestine. Palestine was viewed through a biblical lens, largely disregarding the indigenous Arab population who'd lived there for over a millennium. The goal, transform Palestine into a Jewish homeland. Early Zionist immigration began in the 1880s, financed by patrons like Baron Edmund de Rothschild. Early settlers established agricultural settlements, often on land purchased from absentee landlords in Beirut or Damascus. This process displaced Palestinian tenant farmers who'd cultivated the land for generations. Creating the first points of friction settlements were built as exclusively Jewish enclaves. Separation was explicit. The aim was creating a new Hebrew society, separate from the surrounding Arab world. This was a project of colonization, not ordinary immigration. World War I accelerated the collision course. Seeking advantage versus the Ottomans, Great Britain made contradictory promises to different groups. In 1915, Britain promised Arab independence via the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, a public letter from Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Following the end of World War I, the League of Nations gave Great Britain a mandate to govern Palestine. The terms of the mandate, formalized in 1922, explicitly incorporated the Balfour Declaration. This meant British policy was designed to facilitate the creation of a Jewish national home. This was not a neutral administration. It was a colonial pro-Zionist government. British policies actively promoted Jewish immigration. They promoted land acquisition, and they suppressed Palestinian political aspirations. The Jewish agency operated like a quasi-state. Meanwhile, Palestinian political organization was consistently undermined. Palestinian leaders were often arrested or exiled. In the 1920s and 30s, rising Nazism in Europe pushed Jewish migration. Jewish immigration increased dramatically. The Jewish population grew from less than 10% to around 30% by the mid-1930s. Zionist land purchases continued, dispossessing Palestinian farmers. Many crowded into shantytowns around the cities. Widespread economic distress and social disruption followed. Palestinians saw their land taken and their society marginalized by a colonial power in collusion with a settler movement. This dispossession and political suppression led to resistance. Tensions erupted into violence on several occasions. By 1947, a weakened Great Britain, exhausted by World War II and unable to control the escalating violence in Palestine, decided to hand over the problem to the newly formed United Nations. The Zionist movement had been waging a violent insurgency against British rule, while Palestinian society was still recovering from the crushing of the 1936 revolt. The UN formed a special committee, UNSCOP, which, after a brief visit, proposed a plan to partition Palestine into two states. One Jewish state, one Arab state, with Jerusalem to be under international administration. Show, 1947, UN Partition Plan Map. This plan was fundamentally unjust. It allocated 56% of Palestine to the proposed Jewish state, even though Jewish people owned only about 7% of the private land and made up only about a third of the population. The UN General Assembly approved this partition plan as Resolution 181 on November 29, 1947. The Zionist leadership accepted the plan as a stepping stone to further expansion. a tactical acceptance of a favorable territorial division. The Palestinian leadership and the surrounding Arab states rejected it outright. They saw it as a violation of the principle of self-determination, enshrined in the UN's own charter. The plan sanctioned the division of their homeland and the creation of a state for a settler minority by an external body with no legitimate authority to give away their country. The rejection was not a refusal to live with Jewish neighbors, it was a refusal to accept the colonial dismemberment of their nation. Even before the British Mandate officially ended, the 1948 war began as a civil war between Zionist militias and Palestinian irregulars. The Zionist leadership, however, had long prepared for this moment. They had a detailed plan known as Plan Dalet, which was a blueprint for the systematic ethnic cleansing of Palestine. The plan called for the seizure of strategic positions and the destruction of Palestinian villages to secure the territory of the proposed Jewish state and create a clear Jewish majority within its borders. Starting in December 1947 and accelerating through the spring of 1948, Zionist forces began a series of military operations, attacking and depopulating hundreds of Palestinian villages and urban neighborhoods, long before any Arab armies entered Palestine. When the British finally withdrew on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The surrounding Arab states intervened. Their armies were poorly coordinated, badly equipped, and not genuinely committed to saving Palestine. They were easily defeated by the well-organized and motivated Israeli forces. The war, for Palestinians, was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. By the time armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine, far more than the UN partition plan had allocated. More than 750,000 Palestinians, over half the Arab population, had been forcibly expelled or had fled in terror from their homes. The 1948 Nakba did not mark the end of the conflict but rather the beginning of a new phase. The newly created State of Israel solidified its control over the 78% of Palestine it had conquered, while the remaining 22% was divided. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, came under Jordanian administration. The Gaza Strip was administered by Egypt. The hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees were scattered in camps in these areas. Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. They were denied their internationally recognized right of return by Israel. The Palestinian nation was fragmented. A minority remained as citizens within Israel under military rule, while the majority became a stateless refugee population. Israel, meanwhile, focused on building its state on the ruins of Palestinian society. Tensions remained high for the next 2 decades, culminating in the 1967 Six-Day War. In a preemptive strike, Israel launched a massive attack against Egypt. Israel attacked Syria. Israel attacked Jordan. In just 6 days, the Israeli military achieved a stunning victory. Sinai Peninsula, seized from Egypt. Gaza Strip, seized from Egypt. Golan Heights, seized from Syria. West Bank, seized from Jordan. East Jerusalem, seized from Jordan. With this, Israel came to occupy all of historic Palestine, plus territory from 2 neighboring countries. For Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, the Israeli occupation that began in 1967 instituted a system of total military control over every aspect of their lives. This was not a benign administration but a repressive colonial regime designed to control the population, expropriate land, expropriate resources for the benefit of the Israeli state and its settlers. The entire territory was placed under military law. Palestinians were ruled by military orders and tried in military courts with a near 100% conviction rate, and denied basic civil and political rights. Israeli settlers living in the same territory, often on land confiscated from Palestinians, were governed by Israeli civil law, creating a stark, 2-tiered system of justice, a hallmark of apartheid. Daily existence became a struggle against a matrix of control. The Israeli military erected hundreds of checkpoints, roadblocks, a massive separation wall carving up the West Bank into disconnected cantons, restricting Palestinian freedom of movement to an extreme degree. A simple commute to work, to school, to a hospital could turn into an hours-long ordeal of humiliation and uncertainty. Permits were required for almost everything: to build a home, to farm one's own land, to travel between cities, to leave the territory for medical care. These permits were often arbitrarily denied, serving as a tool of collective punishment and control, making normal life impossible and grinding down the will of the population. The economic consequences of the occupation have been devastating. Israel controls all borders, imports, exports, water and electricity. Israel controls all borders, controls imports and exports, and controls essential resources like water and electricity. Palestinian water resources have been systematically diverted for the use of Israeli settlements. Settlements enjoy lush green lawns and swimming pools, while Palestinian villages often face chronic water shortages. The Palestinian economy has been deliberately de-developed and kept dependent on Israel. This system of control is enforced through constant military presence and violence. By the late 1980s, after 2 decades of brutal military occupation, Palestinian frustration and anger erupted into a massive popular uprising known as the First Intifada, from 1987 to 1993. This was largely a grassroots movement, characterized by civil disobedience, mass protests, strikes, boycotts of Israeli products, and stone-throwing by youths against heavily armed Israeli soldiers. The Intifada brought the plight of the Palestinians back to the world's attention. Israel responded with an iron fist policy of brutal repression, resulting in the deaths of over 1,000 Palestinians and the arrest of tens of thousands more, but it could not extinguish the popular will for freedom. The Intifada created a new political reality, pushing both the Israeli government and the Palestine Liberation Organization toward negotiations. This culminated in the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993 on the White House lawn. The accords were based on the principle of land for peace, and led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority, meant to establish interim self-government. The agreement left Israel with ultimate security control, while granting limited, fragmented authority to the PA. It did not require Israel to stop building settlements, a fatal omission. Throughout the peace process of the 1990s, the number of Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem doubled. Israel continued to confiscate Palestinian land, demolish homes, and expand its network of bypass roads and checkpoints, effectively cementing control while talking about peace. The Palestinian Authority became, in essence, a subcontractor for the occupation, policing its own people on behalf of Israel. The promised final status negotiations were repeatedly delayed, and it became clear Israel had no intention of allowing a truly sovereign Palestinian state. The failure of the Camp David summit in 2000 and Ariel Sharon's provocative visit to Al-Aqsa triggered the Second Intifada. This uprising was far more militarized and violent, leading to immense death and destruction, disproportionately on the Palestinian side. Israel re-entered areas and began massive incursions and the construction of the separation wall. Today, in 2025, the situation remains one of entrenched occupation and unresolved conflict. The peace process that began with the Oslo Accords has been defunct for over 2 decades, leaving a political vacuum filled by despair and escalating violence. The prospect of a 2-state solution has become a practical impossibility. Israel now exercises direct or indirect control over all of historic Palestine. The West Bank is a fragmented archipelago: Palestinian towns, Palestinian villages, illegal Israeli settlements, settler-only roads, military zones. The Gaza Strip, from which Israel withdrew settlers in 2005, has been transformed into the world's largest open-air prison. Since 2007, Israel has imposed a crippling land, air, and sea blockade, controlling everything that goes in and out. This siege, combined with repeated, devastating military assaults, has destroyed Gaza's economy and infrastructure, leading to a humanitarian catastrophe. The majority of Gaza's 2 million residents are refugees, living in extreme poverty with limited access to clean water, electricity, or medical care. The political division among Palestinians, between the PA and the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, has further weakened the movement. This division has been exploited and exacerbated by Israel, which has used it as a pretext to avoid meaningful negotiations. Meanwhile, the international community, led by the United States, has largely failed to hold Israel accountable for systematic violations of international law. Diplomatic statements condemning settlement expansion are rarely backed by concrete action, allowing Israel to continue its colonial project with impunity. The conflict continues because its root cause has never been addressed: the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestine that began in 1948 and continues to this day through occupation, settlement expansion, and displacement. For Palestinians, the goal remains what it has always been: to achieve freedom, justice, and equality in their homeland, whether in a state of their own or in a single democratic state where all inhabitants have equal rights. Until the world recognizes the conflict not as a dispute between 2 equal sides, but as a colonial reality of an occupier and an occupied, a just and lasting peace will remain tragically out of reach.